Hello, all. So now we are going to deal with Philip Freneau's The Indian Burying Ground. And see, it's a very long poem. So we are going to deal with the first part. And here is the first part, beginning with an introduction. Look at this image here. Isn't it something weird? Yeah, you are seeing it right. Here is the skeleton of someone who's been buried in a sitting posture. And this particular poem of Philip Freneau, that is titled The Indian Burying Ground, which was published in the year 1787, is one of the earliest American romantic poems. And you know, the poem is based on Native American burial customs, particularly the practice of burying the dead in a sitting posture. You see that? But here you don't see anything else. You just see the dead here, the skeleton here. But normally the dead are buried with the weapons, food and other possessions of theirs. So now you find that in the whole poem, Freneau seems to be contrasting the European Christian burial practices with that of the present Native American beliefs. And it says that they are more imaginative, they are very vibrant, and they are life affirming. That's something to be mulled over. And you see that the whole poem is divided into two parts, wherein the first part talks about the burial customs, and the second part deals with how the burial ground has to be treated with reverence. Right? So the poem naturally reflects certain romantic characteristics. That is to say, it's quite fascinating with mystery and the supernatural elements there. And it also talks about the speaker's respect for nature, or the poet's respect for nature, and it reveals his interest in indigenous cultures. And above all, this poem is a celebration of imagination over reason, over logic. Okay? And beyond all of these things, it talks about the belief of the Indians in the continuity of life beyond death. See, that's very, very important, and we'll have to look into it, pay attention to it. So now, this poem deals with the concepts of soul and death. And we need to understand that in contrast to the European concept, the Indian concept, that is to say the native Indian concept of soul being alive or active, I should say active, even after death, is something that is being highlighted here. So unlike the European concept of death, where death is looked at as an eternal rest or an eternal sleep, Native Americans believe that the dead continue their activities in another world, a world that they reach beyond their death. So now we're going to focus on the stanza 1, or the first stanza of the poem. And it begins this way: in spite of all the learned have said. So here the poem opens up with a challenge to conventional or traditional wisdom. When I say conventional wisdom, it refers to the European concept. And here the particular word learned refers to educated people, scholars, philosophers, theologians, and even religious authorities who have evolved or who have come up with various theories on death and the afterlife. So the next line, it says, in spite of all the learned have said, the speaker immediately adopts an independent stance, and he says, see, here I look at them, and in spite of all that they have said, in spite of all the intellectual arguments that have been there, okay, there have been enough and more explanations on death and life after death, particularly to say about the profound mysteries such as death. And so he says, I still my old opinion keep. Isn't it too very, affirmative, so very assertive? So the speaker seems to be saying, despite all the theories and teachings of scholars, the speaker, who is just a visitor to an Indian burying ground. So we see the speaker seems to have visited an Indian burying ground, and he says that he still holds his traditional belief. And the phrase old opinion indicates the personal conviction that he has withheld or that has survived despite all the academic learning that he has had so far. So he says, this the old opinion I keep. And so this talks about one of the major or core romantic ideas about the personal intuition and how it works. So he says the personal intuition is more reliable than the logical reasoning or the abstract reasoning. And he says the posture that we give the dead. So in most of the civilization, we find that the dead are buried in the sleeping posture. And when he says the posture that we give the dead, the speaker seems to be referring to the European custom where the dead bodies are laid in a sleeping posture, in a flat form, and in the graves. So here we see the posture is a very, very important word in this poem. We all know that it's the words that form the lines, and the lines that form the stanzas, and the stanzas all together form a poem. So here the word posture is very significant, and that's what makes it a poem. So here it refers to the bodily position, and this posture often symbolizes or is associated with deeper beliefs. So in Christian burials, the body is horizontally laid, and the belief is that in death the dead is sleeping peacefully, and that's the belief, in contrary to the belief of the Native Americans. So it points out the soul's eternal sleep. So the speaker here is symbolically referring to the posture, and he says that the dead, when they are laid in a sleeping position, it simply implies that death can be equated to sleep, eternal sleep. Okay, so eternal sleep is nothing new. It's a common metaphor that you find in almost all poems, all literary work. And so here the eternal sleep refers to a permanent state of rest. So what do you find in this stanza? You find the poet suggesting that the burial customs talk about the cultural beliefs of a particular community. And here that community is nothing but the Indian community. So the Europeans tend to bury their dead as sleepers because they believe that it's going to give them rest. What sort of rest? It's going to be an eternal rest. So death is associated with rest, eternal rest or eternal sleep. So now we find that there is a contrast between the European view and the Native American view. The Europeans consider death as rest, whereas the Native Americans consider death as a continued activity. And here, according to the Europeans, the soul sleeps. But according to the Native Americans, the soul is active even after the death of the person. And the body is laid in a horizontal position, but here in the Native American burial ground or in their graves, the body sits upright. Isn't it something different? So now we move on to the second stanza. We find that not so the ancients of these lands. So who are the ancients of these lands? Undoubtedly the Native Americans. So Freneau suggests that the original inhabitants of America are the Native Americans. And now the speaker tends to compare the Native American beliefs with that of the European customs. And the Indian, when from life released, so when from life released referring to death, and this death is not a kind of a destruction. It just says the word release. And the release, the choice of the word release by the poet is very, very important and very, very suggestive. It suggests liberation from earthly limitations. There are quite a few challenges on earth. There are so many hurdles on earth. There are so many concerns in this earth. But then, when a person is released from all of these things, it's a kind of a liberation. So now, death is not an eternal rest or eternal sleep as the Europeans consider it to be, but here the death seems to be a transition rather than an ending. So it's not an ending as like the Europeans views. Here it is a transition, it's a change. You move from one phase of life to another. So again is seated with his friends. Now who is seated with his friends? The dead person, when he is buried in a sitting posture, seems to be seated with his friends. He is seated with his friends, those who are dead already. So the poet seems to be symbolically interpreting the posture as a kind of a social relationship that seems to be continuing even after his death. So see the first word of this line. What is that? It's again. So it is not something new. It's a repetition of what he's been doing in his life here on earth. So it is a continuity. So nothing that has been important has come to an end. It seems to be moving further. Okay? And shares again the joyous feast. So look here. The dead person is no more brooding over something, or death is not something very scary, or it's not something very something to be bothered about. But then here it's a kind of a celebration. And what sort of a celebration? It's a communal celebration, because the dead person continues to participate in a kind of a feast, not just with himself or his family, but with his friends. So the community extends, and it's a great celebration there. And this feast symbolizes fellowship, happiness, community, and ongoing existence. So as I told you, there is a transition from life to the next life after death. So death is not that separates the dead from the earth. Rather, it does not separate the dead from their friends. Rather, it brings them together even after their death. So it unites them or binds them with their loved ones. And so this particular stanza gives us a radically different concept of the afterlife. And normally in the graveyard or in the burying ground, we experience loneliness or a kind of a silence. But then here it's contrary to all that has been normally associated with the burying ground. Here the dead seem to be enjoying companionship, and the life after death or the afterlife is something that is very vibrant, that's active, that's celebratory and joyful. Okay, so we now move on to the next stanza, that's stanza 3. And here you find the line says, his imaged birds and painted bowl. So, as I told you earlier, the Native Americans normally bury their dead with their possessions. And so here he must have been using a bowl which had imaged birds on it, or the bowl was a painted one. So this imaged bird is a kind of a painting that you can immediately associate with the Native Americans. So there is a kind of a carved or a decorated figure on the bowl, and the bowl is a painted one. It's very colorful. Okay, and this bowl reminds everybody of the everyday life or the day-to-day activities, and it is also a cultural identity. What's the cultural identity, or what's the cultural marker here? The painted bowl, or the bird that's carved on it, the images of the bird that are carved on it. And so these Native Americans believe that these objects will accompany the dead into the next world. Isn't it amazing? Okay, they believed so. And venison for a journey dress. So it's not just the bowl. They also see to it that the dead have some food, as we do when we travel. We pack some food for us. some drink for us. And similarly, for the dead, they have packed venison. Venison, that's the deer that they hunt, and the meat of the deer is venison. So they have prepared a food, and the food is for a journey. And this journey, or this for a journey, and this is a very, very crucial phrase, or a very important phrase. So as I've been talking to you repeatedly, death is not a destination, but it's a voyage, it's a transition, it's a change. And we find that according to the Native Americans, or their belief, according to their belief, the soul is traveling somewhere else to another world. And so when the traveler is on his voyage, or when he's traveling, or when he's on his journey, he'll need some food. And for that, they have prepared, or they have kept venison for him, and bespeak the nature of the soul. So whatever they keep there beside the dead, it all of that speak about the characteristic feature of the soul. Okay, they talk about the important beliefs of the Native American community. So the word bespeak tells us about how it indicates something, or how it underscores something, how it exhibits their culture. And so all of these things, like the venison, the color, the painted bowl with the image, with the bird's image on it, all of these tell us about what the Native Americans believed with regard to the soul, or what beliefs they associated with regard to the dead and the soul. Okay, so the next line says, activity that knows no rest. See, it's totally in contradiction with the European concept. Death is associated with eternal rest, but here they say, hey, it's not just it's not any rest. Okay, there is something, there is kind of an activity that's going to take place beyond this. So this is one of the most crucial lines of the poem, and here it talks about the Native Americans' belief of how the soul remains active. And he says, because the soul is active, the soul is never inactive or unconscious. So it is well contrasted with the European concept. And here, according to the Native Americans, because the soul knows no rest and it engages in an activity, we believe that they had the belief of the soul being very living, moving, acting, that is to say, full of life. So the soul, according to the Native Americans, was full of life. So now, everything that they buried along with the dead, everything pointed out to a continued life. So it is never associated with any rest. And how do you look at the soul? The soul is not a tired one, it is not worn out, but the soul is energetic and it has a purpose. So the soul is purposeful, and as the scholars ahead or earlier have told, the afterlife is not a passive life, but it is an active life. So now we move on to the next stanza, and the next stanza, it begins this way: his bow for action ready bent. See, venison meat, and then there was the painted bowl with the image of the bird, and now you have a bow itself there, and the bow is all ready. See, it's not just lying down, it's all ready for an action. So probably the dead is not somebody ordinary, the dead is a warrior. And so the warrior is buried with a bow, and the bow is all prepared for immediate use, and the bow is not broken, it's not a discarded bow, it's a bow that's fully ready for use, for optimal use. So again, it suggests how the dead is ready for action, and how the warrior's role is not just ceased. Okay, it continues even after death, and it doesn't stop with that. And arrows, along with the bow, they have kept the arrows also, and the arrows have with a head of stone. Okay, there are head of stone also. So the arrows are very well tipped. Actually, they are practical weapons. So again, what if they might need the arrows, because he's a warrior, and in the afterlife he might need it for hunting. So it implies future activity. And so normally people would wonder, why would a sleeping person or a person in eternal rest need weapons? But here the Native Americans believe that the souls are going to be fully active, and so they have buried the warrior with the bow and the arrow, not just the arrow, even with the arrowhead also. Okay, so it suggests again active existence can only mean that life is spent. So here it just means that they have completed one part of their life or one phase of their life. It's a transition. So earthly life has not come to an end. There's going to be another part of it. So probably the physical body is not functioning any longer, but the soul continues to live, and not the old ideas gone. So although the body has died, it doesn't mean that they have severed themselves from their communal belief, from their identity, from their community. So they are still members of their community. They still uphold the values and beliefs and ideologies of their community. So even if their body dies physically, their beliefs and identity still survives. So their habits are alive, their values are alive, and their character as an individual person is fully active. So the warrior will continue to be a warrior. Okay, so that's what it is. And here we find that if there is death can only destroy the body, but the essential self continues to live. It moves on to the next world. And so this is something that's associated with the romantic concepts. And so it talks to us about the romantic interest in immortality and spiritual continuity. So with this, we come to the end of part 1 of this poem, and we shall catch up with the rest of the poem in the second part. Thank you for watching.